Our reading is from Peter's first letter, and I think of this as a lovely, compact letter. Great. And it's chapter 3, verses 8 to 18. Finally, all of you, be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. For whoever will love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats, do not be frightened, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness, yes, I read that, haven't I? Keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. For it is better, if it is God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. Amen, and thank you, Peter.
So I was explaining last week that we're doing a series together called Constructive Church. I explained last week one of the things that seems to be quite a big thing at the moment within the Christian world in particular is the idea of deconstruction. It's questioning the things that we've received, perhaps because we see they're not working anymore, or they've actually become almost the opposite of the good news that we once believed them to be. One of the analogies I made last week was this idea that often when Jesus came, he shared this little thing about wine and wineskins. And he taught, didn't he, about like you don't put new wine in an old wineskin because it will sort of stretch and burst and you will lose the wine. And my idea was what we want to do as a church together and what actually we ought to do as individual Christians is not get precious about the wineskin, but become more precious about the wine that we've been given to share. Every generation has to work at the task of understanding and knowing how the good news should be presented and resonate with those around. And most of you will agree, I've been a Christian since a teenager, the world has changed. And perhaps the way we've always done things and the way we've always supposedly presented the gospel is making the actual good news spill out in front of us rather than being accepted by others. Now, I do apologise for my tricky comments sometimes. I did have an experience once where an evangelist was invited to a prayer meeting when I was younger, and he started praying, and I thought, when's he going to stop? And he didn't stop. And you know, like when people are praying, and you think, oh, right, that's a natural stop. Now I can pray my prayer, and they jump in again. I sat in that room, and I thought, this feels like I like the sound of my own voice, or I'm the only one who's evangelistic enough to pray in this meeting. I felt really I just felt there was no sense of we're praying together. It was just, I'm going to get all my prayers said and done, and I'm not going to stop until, I don't know, so that's why sometimes I have a bit of a bad impression. Right, let's see if this works. So I'm going to put some, woohoo, here we go. So evangelism. So somebody mentioned Billy Graham right at the beginning. And Billy Graham was asked once, of all the people that went down in his crusades, or whatever, not crusade is a bad word, but in his evangelistic campaigns, how many did he feel really sort of made it to the other side? So let's say the question was, of the 1,000 people, Billy, that responded at Old Trafford, how many do you think made it to the point of true discipleship and true living out? And Billy Graham said about 25%. Now, a bit of research was done on the back of that, not because people wanted to doubt Billy Graham, but we live in a world where people check information out now. And it was found that in actual fact, only 6% of all of the people that have gone forward at a Billy Graham event have actually kind of gone all the way through into some kind of fulfilling Christian life. Now, that's not to then discredit everything that Billy Graham does, because Jesus, we should understand that. Jesus told that story, didn't he, about the seed and the sower, and that sometimes you'll only get, you'll get a really good increase, but only from a small amount of the crop. Some will spring up really, really quickly, run to the front to pray a commitment prayer, and then you'll never, ever see them again when the cares of the world get hold of them. But Billy Graham, I suppose in a way, if you ask anybody from a certain era about evangelists, they'll mention someone like Billy Graham. He's there. He was an evangelist. He was someone who believed that he needed to share the good news of Jesus so that other people could receive that good news too. And I must admit, whenever I watch him back now, or he appears on a little clip, he's an inspiring preacher, isn't he? You know, he's got a really, really fantastic way of communicating. Billy Graham. Now, people have tried to continue his legacy in carrying on the Billy Graham evangelistic organisation and stuff, but it's not been as successful. And I wonder that's because the world is changing. Here's another example of evangelism. Jesus Christ will return soon. And perhaps he might give me a suitcase instead of a trolley, I don't know. But there we go. That's an image that other people have in their minds about evangelism. When you say the word evangelism, it means frightening yourself to death to go on the street and try and get other people to understand that Jesus is on his way back, or you need to receive him because you're sinful. Has anybody ever walked down Market Street and heard a street preacher? And do you ever think it's good what they're saying? Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? But the thing is, I was in Sheffield yesterday and I saw this couple singing. And I thought, that's not going to work. But then I said, yeah, but they do really think they should be doing that. They do really think that, we've got to share the gospel. But I just don't think any of that kind of stuff resonates. I found it funny one day that there was a street preacher in Manchester, and a group of young girls were arguing with this street preacher. over a controversial subject, and the street preacher had no idea how to engage with these young people on a contextual issue around their bodies. Very, very interesting. He just wanted to bark out a pre sort of rehearsed message, and I hope that somebody got saved as a result. So we've got street preachers. Has anybody ever done street preaching? You've done it, have you, Mike? You've done it?
Only once.
Yeah, did you enjoy it?
No, I didn't. The guy came towards me with a meat cleaver and I moved very fast.
What about you, Philip?
I was part of a group that went into Laria Flats, the green area, and they were contracts. I don't even have four.
Yeah.
And we took it in turn to say a school.
Okay.
With a megaphone thing as well.
Did you enjoy that? Did you?
Well, it seemed to me right at the time.
Yeah.
Maybe it was just right for me. I don't know.
Yeah. Because I've done door knocking on missions and I enjoyed it at the time, but I wouldn't think of doing it now. But yeah, okay, yeah. Here's another one that don't know why. What I wanted to highlight here is when I was younger, we used to go to the Full Gospel Businessmen's meetings and things like Women Aglow, you know, the charismatic parachurch organisations. And they would always throw up in front of people in their evangelistic meetings somebody who'd been a gangster, a womanizer, a drug addict, or whatever, and they'd tell this really dramatic story of change. And it always seems to be the way that, you know, you've got to have led the dirtiest life possible to have the best testimony for others, which kind of rubs most of our lives out of the picture, doesn't it, you know? But anyway, you know, and me and my mum would take people to these, but the only sort of criticism I always had of it is, you know, your average Joe will say, well, clearly you needed this experience because you were going off the rails. I don't need that experience. So sometimes somebody like, bless him, I've met Barry Woodward. I don't know if anybody else knows Barry Woodward, who's a former addict. And I must admit, he is, if he talks to addicts, he resonates with them. If he talks to anybody else, and it's just kind of like, well, it's great to see that that's happened for you, but we don't need it, you know. You can. And the other thing about sort of gangster-based evangelism, I don't mean going robbing like banks and then leave them a tract in the vault or something like that, is, you know, I think often it can really make you feel that whatever you've got to share is rubbish in comparison. Do you know what I mean? I remember once sharing my testimony. It was at a point in my life when really I was struggling with lots and lots of things. But I was preceded by someone who absolutely brought the house down. And I just stood and I thought, I haven't got a testimony. Do you know what I mean? I just thought, I haven't got a testimony. I haven't got anything like that. What value have I got? So sometimes it can be a bit of a danger when we only throw people up the front who have got the really sort of, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly stories.
There was a man called Noel Proctor.
Yes.
Who wrote a book. He was a criminal, and his story, Jesus appeared to him in his cell.
Yeah.
Side effect of that was, in Northern, there was a minister called Noel Proctor. Everybody's ringing him up to say to come and speak to them.
And he was like, I've only ever drunk tea and had scones all my life. Another thing about evangelism is there's a car salesman. Sometimes evangelism can look like a sales pitch, can't it? You know, have you ever gone to evangelism seminars where basically you're tooled up in the right way that you can sell the product? Now, if you follow anybody called, and bless these people because I'm not judging them, but it's the way that they do things. So there's a guy called Ray Comfort, and his big thing is you convince people by questioning them that they are sinners, Then once you've done that, you convince them that they're going to hell because they're sinners. Then you get them to pray a prayer. And then he doesn't know what to do next, but he just grants that they've prayed the prayer. So basically, you have a spiel of things that you do or say, and it's designed for the person to grab the keys off you and go away with the products. Now, it can feel quite cold and clinical, that. And I've always thought, whenever I've gone into a shop and I get minded by a salesman, I always run a mile. I think, no thanks, I can do my own research. I went to a phone shop once, but I wanted a new phone when I was about 24, 25. And I don't buy things straight away unless I'm with someone who forces me to buy things, like an enabler. I often want to check loads of things out and then make my mind up. And I sat in this shop, I think it was a car phone warehouse, and the top sales guy ended up sitting with me and was insistent that I should buy this particular phone. And then he wrote a price down, and then he crossed it out and he said, "I'll give it you for this. Why would you not take it for that?" And I walked out of the shop. And I said, "No, you're forcing me to buy something. I don't want it. Go away." You know. And sometimes you can get people that you wonder if they do really care about souls, or if they just care about being able to say, "I'm at the top of the rankings with the amount of souls that I've saved." So evangelism sometimes could feel a bit like that. It can also feel like a trophy. I've won a soul. Remember that sort of phrase, isn't it? You know, we're to be soul winners. I think Spurgeon wrote a book, didn't he, about winning souls or something like that. Like we've got a prize when we've led someone to Jesus. Now, I've led people to Jesus, and it's a fantastic feeling when you do it. But often you can sort of slip into the way that you meet another friend who's a Christian, and if you know that they've never led anybody to the Lord, you look down on them. They're not quite on fire enough. Or actually, sometimes when we treat people as trophies, we dehumanize them in the very act of sharing our faith with them. So have you ever heard things like friendship evangelism? Whereas most of your friends know that you're not really the friends. You're just the friends so that they'll actually make a decision. I remember one of my friends in London once said they started some kind of soup kitchen at his church. They started it, and somebody came in and said, "Do you love us?" And he said, "Yeah." And they said, "No, you don't. You're giving us soup to get us to church on a Sunday. You don't love us. You love your concept of filling your church up." People get clued up to these things. Now, those could be all the negatives. Oh, this is a big one as well. Has anybody ever got clobbered with this? There will be blood on your hands if you don't share the gospel. Anybody ever heard that? Gosh, I'm so glad you've not been traumatized with that kind of fearful thinking. But often that what makes the rounds in certain circles is this idea. It comes from the book of Ezekiel, I think, where Ezekiel's told to go and give a prophecy, and God says to him, "If you don't give it, I'll require their blood from your hands. And if you give it and they ignore it, I'll require their blood from your hands." It's quite a savage image, isn't it? But I do know a lot of people who are driven to evangelism through that kind of fear. And it's really not genuine when fear throws us into evangelism. Now, even though that might not be current here, I've heard that, and I've had that said to me an awful lot of times. And it's one of the things that I worry about with parachurch organizations and things like the God Channel, because even though things might not be said here, they definitely do get said in other places. We need to watch out. God does not want us sharing our faith because we're going to be punished if we don't, because that's adding to the gospel as far as I'm concerned. So there's a load of negatives. Let me just quickly backtrack, though, on this one. Listen, the thing is, as much as we can say, well, look, we haven't all got a testimony like that, or we could look at some of the meetings we've been to and say, well, the story was so emotional, it was kind of manipulative. But what you have to say, what I think all of us have to say, to be fair, is I've met people like that, and Jesus has genuinely changed their lives. So Jesus does change people's lives. Now, he's changed my life in a way that doesn't kind of equal that kind of straightforward testimony, but Jesus has changed my life, and I'm sure most people in here would say we've had encounters with Jesus. Some of you might be sat here because of Billy Graham, and you're the 6%. You've it's not that you're any better than the rest that went forward, it's just for some reason the calling on your life has been a lot more effectual. So I don't want to throw everything under the bus. But what I do want to say is I think sometimes evangelism, we shy away from it because it has all these caricatures with it. So, what can we say from the Bible? Because the Bible, I think, is the best place to go. Peter writes this morning, and I agree with Philip, I really like Peter's letters because they're really short and condensed and punchy and sweet. But the one thing that is right sort of couched in the middle of all of this when I get there is this. But in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Number one, Christ as Lord. And always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. So here's the first thing. There's an invitation to a birthday party. And I think the Bible is much more about share your story when somebody asks you. Don't assume that everybody wants to hear about your faith or your story because you're desperate to convert the world. Sometimes we are trying to give something to people who just don't want it or don't see the need for it. And I've seen people get in endless arguments doing evangelism with people who don't want it. They've started crying and they've started screaming. And I thought, they don't want it. Leave them alone. Don't traumatize them now because you believe that they need to have what you have. They've not asked you to tell them this. That's my gripe with street preachers. Nobody asked in Manchester on a Sunday as they were going into the night shop to be assaulted by the fact that they're sinners and Jesus is coming again. Nobody asked for it. And I actually think it's easy to stand on a street and do that than to do what the Bible really asks us to do. We are to be a people who share our stories when we are invited to. Pete Baker shared here once, preached here, and he said a phrase that I really attached to. He said, nobody will listen to your story until you've sat and listened to their story. Nobody wants to hear your story before you've had the grace to listen to their story. So firstly, we are to be a people that respond to invitation, not be governed and pushed by fear and pressure of other churches or other Christians. How do you do that? How do you get yourself in the position where a person asks you about your faith? Boom, community. And I don't mean church community. I mean community. We've got to start living better with other people. I've often talked to one or two people in this church, in the leadership team, about the mantra when I was younger that was around in the Christian world, which was all about get out of the world as quickly as possible. Because if you stay in the world, you'll become like the world and you'll backslide. And so everybody retreated behind a line, a lot of people at least, retreated behind a line and ended up just with Christian friends. Then all you can do is go on missions and bash people on the head with the gospel and then come home and go back behind that line. But you see, if somebody's to ask me, what's the reason of my hope? I've got to be in a place of community where they've got access to me. This, for me, is what really mission and evangelism is all about. We're supposed to live in community with other people. Another question for evangelism. It's not when somebody asks you, give them a pre-prepared spiel. It's give a reason for the hope that you have. And I wonder today if we could just on the spot give a reason for the hope that we have. I think I'll leave that as a challenge. We might pick that up next week. What's the reason for the hope that you have? What does this faith mean to you if somebody should ask? So people ask us because we live in community, and we are prepared to give a reason for the hope that we have. But there's two things that Peter puts at the end of the phrase in verse 15 that I think are the most important. Do this with gentleness and respect. Gentleness and respect. Model the fruit of Jesus Christ in your sharing of his way. Can often get lost, can't it, that? Gentleness and respect. Especially when somebody refuses your way and you get angry with them because of it, you've lost your witness effectively when you do that. Gentleness and respect should be what is written on our hearts whenever we engage with the world. And that gentleness and respect can manifest in that if they don't want to hear the full story, you back off and don't give them the full story, and you wait, and whatever. You go at their pace. There we go, patience. You see, if we are going to be a people who situate ourselves within local community and we're not frightened of the other and we're in community, then we're going to have patience. I wonder whether it may take a year or more before anybody in the warm room says, I'd like to come to church. And that's not why we're doing it, but it may take a long time. And we have to be patient. And there's a really messy bedroom. True evangelism is absolutely messy. True work with others is messy. Now, I'm going to say something, and this is a critical thing. This is critical. Most of us believe that Jesus cleans our lives up. He tidies our lives. But what I have noticed with lots of Christians is that they would rather sit with everybody that's got the tidy lives than go and be with the people who've got the untidy, messy lives. It's comfortable to be with your own. It's uncomfortable to be with the other. And I often have to ask myself this question, and I will ask you this question too. Who do we choose to sit next to in life? Who do we choose to sit next to, and who by default do we choose not to sit next to or with? See, if I only choose to sit next to the people like me, I'll never evangelize because they'll all be the same as me. Nobody will need to know stories together. I think we have to get better as church at appreciating the mess of life and sitting with people in the mess of their own lives. As traumatic as that is, we have to learn to do it. Being with people is much more important than barking a message at them. In fact, a message they wouldn't listen to if you wasn't with them. Now, there's another thing that we need to consider in the world in which we live, which is when I was younger, there wasn't this presence, or it wasn't as visible to me anyway in the world, of all of these other faiths. We now live in a sort of multi-faith, multicultural society. How do we do evangelism in a world like this? How do we do it? Do we meet people and argue why their religion is wrong and ours is right? I just don't think that works. So how do we connect? How do we almost share the treasure of Christ that we have in a multi-faith, multicultural world? And I don't know if there's a symbol for atheism in there, but that really should be considered as some kind of religious ideology in the mix too. How do we do that? Well, somebody has suggested that one of the best ways that we can do sharing of faith with others is to find out where their treasure and our treasure connect, and appreciate and kind of help one another to sort of live from that treasure and discuss and debate and walk with one another. Now, this is the hardest thing for me as someone who was brought up in a sort of very evangelical, charismatic culture. When I went for a walk with my Hindu friend who was a life coach a few months ago, and I found so much crossover between me and him in terms of what my faith spoke to me about and what his faith did. And it really genuinely troubled me, because it was the first time I'd really gone for a walk with somebody from another religion. And the purpose of it wasn't we're going to talk about our different religions. It just came up. And it shocked me how if you just pulled the name labels off what he was doing and put my name labels on, it was exactly the same thing. And that was something that I kind of came away and thought, well, how do I handle that? Should I have not just argued with him that, his way is wrong? We are good friends now, because I'm learning the art of trying to walk together with other people who might not believe what I believe. But I think that act in and of itself is a good news gospel act. That I'm not going to withdraw from somebody because they have a different belief system. I'm still going to walk with them and be part of humanity for them. Because the essence is, the whole thing that I think we're doing, like we said last week, is we've got a treasure. We've got a particular treasure, haven't we? Relationship with God through Jesus. And it's the treasure that we want to share with others. We want to help them locate treasure, and good treasure, for themselves. We're not about selling people something that they don't want, or convincing them about some questions that they have never been asking. We're purely to be sharers of the gospel. Now, I didn't have time to write a sketch this morning, but I would have loved to have done a sketch where somebody goes to the shop to buy a phone, and they're just browsing, and then this salesman comes and mitres them. They leave the shop with something that they never wanted to buy just to get rid of this guy. And then another scene where you've got somebody having a coffee or having a beer, and this guy says, oh, I got this new phone, it's really, really good. And they just have a conversation. The person goes and buys the phone. Because on that side, something has been shared. On this side, something has been pushed and forced upon somebody else. I have friends now who, were forced into evangelism, forced into these ways of evangelism, who will never go to church. Some of them have burnt the Bible and all kinds of stuff because of the trauma of a mentality that forces people to do things in particular ways. I think we need to get really, really good at new evangelism. I don't think we live in a world now where we're going to get any Billy Grahams on the scene. I think Billy Graham fit the world in which he was born in and carried out the calling that he had. People still try and replicate it, or people go on the streets, but as far as I'm concerned, it all boils down to the second half. We are to be invited. We are to wait until we are invited to share. And we're to do that because we're in community. We are to live in community. We are to be a non-judgmental presence in our world. And we are that because we have a hope to share. We're to do it with gentleness and respect and patience, honoring another person's boundaries in the act of sharing. We are to just appreciate life is messy. We don't just get to hang about with the people who have been cleaned up. We're called into the mess. And we do this in a very, very different world, where screaming and shouting on the streets at others just ain't gonna work. One of my friends who worked for Wycliffe Bible Translators, he went and did a placement in a fundamental Islamic community. And he said what was interesting is they were evangelizing him with all the scare tactics that he was evangelized with as a child in his fundamentalist church. You know, it just doesn't work. Too many people now are walking away or deconstructing or asking questions because they realize they've been sort of driven out of fear into a sort of decision for Jesus. We need to be people that choose to sit alongside others and live our lives with others in the mess that they have, patiently enduring the call to work alongside others, so that with our gentleness and with our respect, they begin to see the hope that we have, and they themselves begin to long and ask for that hope for themselves. Amen.